So I'd like to talk about the topic that I call adaptive unpleasantness. And this refers to this notion that pain and misery and anxiety and depression are actually adaptations, which is unfortunate because those things are quite horrible. And it might seem counterintuitive because how could these, again, such unpleasant things actually be beneficial? Well, that's because natural selection isn't necessarily about health or happiness. Natural selection is about survival and reproduction. So if a trait such as pain enhances the reproductive fitness of the individual, then despite it being unpleasant, it's going to be favored by natural selection. Now this notion is actually was covered quite well in a quote by eminent evolutionary scholar Richard Dawkins in his book The River Out of Eden. And he says that nature is neither kind nor unkind. Nature is not interested in suffering one way or another unless it affects the survival of DNA. It is easy to imagine a gene that, say, tranquilizes gazelles when they are about to suffer a killing bite. Would such a gene be favored by natural selection? Not unless the act of tranquilizing a gazelle improves that gene's chance of being propagated into future generations. It is hard to see why this would be so, and we may therefore guess that gazelles suffer horrible pain and fear when they are pursued to death, as many of them eventually are. So Richard Dawkins did a great job at depicting this scenario, at really demonstrating the adaptive value of pain, both physical pain and emotional pain. In a direct side-by-side comparison, if you have one individual that does not experience pain, does not experience anxiety or worry, and you have another individual who experiences, physical pain and is extremely anxious of predators. It's always kind of looking out, has high vigilance as a result. Which one do you think is going to have a greater chance of leaving descendants? So clearly the one that feels pain and is horrified by being pursued to the death by predators. So obviously they're going to leave more descendants. And what's interesting is obviously the next generation are going to have those tendencies to a greater extent. And then which ones are going to be favored from that group, and then so on and so forth. So when you kind of extrapolate that, and then now it sort of makes sense why so many animals are very skittish, and kind of always on alert and always vigilant, because that's obviously what's been favored. So it's not always that easy to discover the adaptive value of a particular trait. So sometimes it's really advantageous to look at individuals that are not expressing that trait and see what they're sort of going through, and that usually provides a good measure of what the value of possessing such a trait is. So for example, what's the adaptive value of earwax? I don't know. Just find someone that doesn't produce earwax and see what they're going through. So it just so happens there is a condition in humans where individuals do not actually feel pain. They're sort of insensitized to pain. And they refer to this as congenital analgesia, or congenital insensitivity to pain. And these individuals, despite not feeling pain, go through sort of very agonizing lives. So kind of the agony of not feeling pain. And there's this interesting story, and sad story, of this individual, Stephen Pete, and his twin brother, identical twin brother. So they both sort of grew up having this condition. When they were very young, they ended up chewing parts of their tongue off, and again, it's because when you're small, and you're teething and you're biting down on your tongue, usually the pain will cause a stop sign and have you hit the brakes. But if you don't have that sort of pain, that motivation to stop, you just go ahead and just bite right on through. So they bit off parts of their tongue growing up when they're teething. They had many bumps and bruises and broken bones, and the parents had Child Protective Services called on them a few times, as you could imagine. They were bullied at school. And then Stephen's brother was stricken to a wheelchair, which is actually very common for this condition. And it's not because of these massive injuries, you know, like just because you don't feel pain doesn't make you more likely to get hit by a car or you know, run your foot over with a lawnmower. Well, what does happen is when you're sitting down or you're in an awkward position, you don't really feel that discomfort. And a lot of times the discomfort is going to motivate you to sort of change your posture so that you don't sort of wear down a limb. And even pain will, you know, can prevent you from overexerting yourself in other regards too. So if individuals aren't feeling those types of pain, they're not going to do the small adjustments. So a lot of times their bodies will just physically just break down earlier, sort of prematurely age. So anyway, Stephen's brother was stricken to a wheelchair and eventually committed suicide. So quite a sad story, and it really shows again the adaptive value of pain, where individuals that do not experience pain rarely make it past their 30s. So that covers the general sort of adaptive value of pain. What are the specific categories? Right? How does it specifically provide a benefit to individuals? Well, my collaborator, Andrew Gallup, who I'm going to be interviewing at the end of this video with regards to taking painkillers actually as an evolutionary mismatch. Well, Andrew summed up the three categories of benefit that pain actually provides. When it comes to pain, Andrew states it as, pain draws our attention and serves to motivate responses to alleviate the discomfort. In ancestral conditions, this would have resulted in behavioral changes that function to reduce harm, minimize further damage, and prompt us to learn to avoid situations and actions that led to pain in the past. So Andrew really sums up, again, the benefits of pain to these three basic categories. So first, it really draws your attention to sort of harmful stimuli. So you can imagine, you know, if you're reaching your hand and grabbing something that's hot, that heat will immediately have you sort of withdraw your hand, so you don't sort of melt it and, you know, further damage it. So you can immediately withdraw. Same thing if you're reaching into a beehive to get some honey and you got stung by bees, you know, you'll immediately withdraw your hand. If you're overexerting yourself and you're feeling pain, you know, in your knees or your back, or that'll allow you to stop what you were doing. So it really draws your attention to sort of harmful stimuli. The second benefit, it kind of goes along with the first one essentially, and that's if you are already injured, if you did experience an injury, pain prevents further injury or re-injury, or helps sort of motivate you away from causing further harm. So, for example, a serious injury like a twisted ankle or hurt knee, or that would be a death sentence to a hunter-gatherer who rely on sort of running for a living. So, if they did suffer an injury, it behooves them to allow it to heal so that they can actually be functional in the future, and they don't actually have to be devastated by this sort of injury. So again, that pain should remain until sort of that injury essentially is healed and that part can now be functional again, and then you can just go off and run. But ultimately, individuals shouldn't sort of blow through that stop sign as it could cause potentially take a small injury from, say, a twisted ankle and make it much, much larger, again, which would essentially be a death sentence to a hunter-gatherer. And this is actually pretty relevant nowadays when you think about not just professional athletes, but amateur athletes and just, you know, the average person. When they actually experience a pain or injury from exercising, and instead of sort of resting and healing, They take painkillers and just kind of push on through. And that can obviously have devastating consequences and, prematurely sort of break down your body. Now, the third adaptive value, or the third category of benefit of pain, it serves as a pretty powerful motivator to learn from. That's why it's used in discipline so much. You learn right away. So think about something like if I, like the aforementioned example, if I reached my hand into a beehive to grab the honey and I got stung by some bees as a result, I'm going to remember that, and I'm not going to want to do that again because it hurt. And not only that, what facilitated me to learn is actually the yellow, the bright markings on those bees actually facilitates that learning. That bright yellow color is also very easy to remember too. So that's why you tend to find that harmful animals, such as bees and wasps and things like, poisonous frogs are usually brightly colored. They have that bright sort of coloring. It's called aposematism. The idea behind that is to communicate, that they are actually dangerous. So they're much, much easier to learn from individuals when they're just sort of these beacons of light and bright colors than if they were sort of cryptic or sort of ordinary looking. So yeah, pain really does serve as a powerful motivator of behavior. So again, to summarize, the three adaptive benefits of physical pain are: one, it draws your attention to something that's harmful stimuli. Again, this could be severe things, or twisting an ankle, or even sitting in an uncomfortable way to readjust to not sort of wear down your joints and maximize circulation. And the second benefit, again, is to prevent re-injury. It sort of puts up that stop sign, says, whoa, slow down for a minute here. And then the third is that it provides a very powerful stimulus to learn from, a very powerful motivator to learn from. So that covers physical pain, but what about emotional pain? And specifically, I'm talking about depression and anxiety. What is the benefit of just feeling bad? Nobody likes feeling that way. So how is that somehow good for the individual? Well, first I'm going to talk about depression, and then I'll cover sort of anxiety next. So depression, you could generally think about it as just low mood, this feeling of just dejection, and it usually accompanies loss. You can very quickly associate depression with loss, just like joy with some kind of gain. So depression is typically associated with a loss, but so you don't want to necessarily get caught up on how depression feels. You want to think of, what does depression make you do? So what is depression motivating you to do? Well, one thing it's good at is it actually causes you to withdraw socially. And, this might seem like a bad thing, but it causes you to withdraw and then think about what happened. Think about why you're depressed. It might not seem very healthy at the moment, but if you sort of withdraw from distractions and focus your attention on what this scenario is that you basically lost, then that could help you sort of essentially focus and try to correct that in the future. Now, the other thing that you could think about with depression is it really sort of is like an emotional slap in the face. You can imagine if I was like, say, reaching for this banana and then I got slapped in the face, I'd probably stop reaching for that banana, especially if it happened repeatedly. So you can think of the same way with depression. So imagine if you're interested in a potential mate, the individual is not interested in you back. That's kind of like a slap in the face. You feel this constant rejection, and it hurts. That's why they describe it as hurting, because it's not hurting physically, but it still hurts. Now, the reason for that is again, it's the same thing. If I'm going for this banana and I'm getting slapped, it's going to discourage me from going that banana and basically encourage me to do anything else. Now, same thing with depression. If I'm going after this this potential mate, and the individual doesn't want me, that's not a very prosperous direction I'm going. So I'm basically discouraging myself from pursuing that path. So ultimately, and to borrow the words from Randolph Nesse, that depression causes individuals to divest from unpropitious ventures and reinvest in more fruitful options. So again, you can see sort of the adaptive value. Now you feel depression because you experienced a loss. Think about what happened so you can correct it for next time and avoid this horrible situation again. And second of all, you are discouraging yourself from continuing on in that sort of losing situation. And that's why people that generally are depressed, usually the best way to try to relieve the situation is to have some kind of lifestyle change. And it's also why the medication for antidepressants are typically very unsuccessful. Now, why would depression be more common nowadays than, say, ancestrally? Well, one, we don't know how depressed hunter-gatherers were. We can look at their bones and figure out certain things with health, but ultimately you can't go back. You can't look at and see if they were sort of happy or not. But you can imagine why depression might be elevated nowadays. Depression is typically highest in college-age students, and you wonder why. College-age students, upper teens, in the 20s, that's actually prime reproductive years, and that's when hunter-gatherers were really sort of developing their family, really starting producing their families. So at that time, you're really starting to sort of pair up with these mates that are going to last potentially the rest of your life. So there's very important decisions with huge consequences. So you can imagine that romantic situations that end poorly in college should be much more devastating to an individual during those years than, say, before or after. Not to say it's going to be a walk in the park, outside of college. That's just simply saying that at relatively those relationship moments should potentially be the most devastating when you think about it. All right, so that covers depression. What about anxiety? Anxiety, it's best described as that sort of inner feeling of turmoil, where you're just, oh no, something is going to go wrong, or something's going horribly wrong. That's basically anxiety. So what's the benefit of feeling that way? Well, there are three main benefits you can think about as far as anxiety goes. The first is that it actually boosts performance on mentally challenging tasks. So when you're anxious, you're really sort of taking in as much information and as much of the surroundings as you possibly can, and it really sort of helps you acquire information to solve that problem. So you can imagine if you're diffusing a bomb, you're not just going to do anything all crazy right away, willy-nilly. You're going to be pretty focused and looking at every little thing so you don't mess up. Again, it's really good for sort of drawing you're focusing on this problem that needs to be solved. So it really helps with mentally challenging tasks. Just imagine if you went to take an exam and you weren't anxious at all, you had no anxiety. How do you think you'd perform on the exam versus if you had some anxiety? Again, don't think of anxiety being always overwhelming anxiety, but just having some anxiety. So clearly, individuals, if there's some anxiety, you're actually going to perform a little better in mentally challenging tasks, not physically challenging tasks. And that's kind of like sports analogy, where they got caught thinking too much. That's how anxiety can actually harm you in physically challenging tasks or physically demanding tasks. Because in physically demanding tasks, you just need to just read and react immediately. So in sports, you don't want to be caught out there thinking. You want to be doing. So basically, you want anxiety when you're taking a test, you're defusing a bomb, but not if you're like a fighter pilot or. Yeah. So another benefit of anxiety is that it boosts defensive behaviors. So just think about it. If while you're watching this video, you hear some noise outside, you don't know what it was. It's just some loud noise. That's immediately going to sort of boost these defensive behaviors. You're going to start scanning around, looking to see where did that come from. We're trying to identify this sort of ambiguous threat. Where is it? What is it? Your heart rate's going to elevate. You're basically going to activate that fight or flight response. Just think about it. If someone's really anxious, you can't sneak up on someone that's really anxious that well at all. They're really difficult people to sneak up on. Don't do that. Obviously, they're anxious, so they might already be close to the edge. Now, there is a difference actually between anxiety and fear. So, for example, let's say you're hiking and you're anxious that bears might be around. You're just extra vigilant. You're kind of looking around. You're just you're in just a sort of defensive, anxious state. You'll be the first one to identify the bear if you're that way for sure. So you can see the adaptive benefit there. But let's say now you do come across the bear. Now you see it. You're not scanning the environment for it. There's no ambiguous threat out there. You know where the threat is. That is now fear. And it's actually kind of interesting because they measure you measure fear and anxiety differently, and it's important because if you wanted to say test out anti-anxiety drugs, you don't want them to necessarily reduce fear, and if you want to test out essentially a fear reducing drug, something that would quell panic attacks, where you are responding to something directly. So you would want to quell those, but not necessarily reduce the individual's anxiety. So they're two different things. So how they test this, or one of the ways they test this, is using mice in this mouse defense test battery. That's what this apparatus is called. It's basically like a track, kind of loops around. It's got little straightaways and little curves. And you can run this track in two conditions, basically. You can have the track open, where the individual, the animal, the little mouse can run laps in this thing. Or you could have it sort of little walls up where the individual, the mouse is confined in space. So what they do, if you get a mouse and you expose it to a predator, like a rat or a cat, and then obviously it's going to be freaking out, and you drop it inside this container in one of those two conditions. You drop in the open container, and it's going to start just running away. And basically the intensity of its fleeing, the intensity of its running away, so how far did it go, how fast did it go, that is what they use as a metric of fear. Okay, now the other condition, so now you expose this mouse to a cat or a rat, and you just drop it in this this apparatus, but now it can't run away. It can't just flee. It's stuck here now. So what it does is it basically paces back and forth very, very quickly, very anxiously. And the reason between for the pacing and back and forth, it's basically it can't run away. So it's trying to accumulate any information it can about this environment and try to figure out another way around it. So they're, again, two different situations. And you can see, when you're anxious for something, you pace around. When you're terrified and afraid of something, you usually run away. So ultimately, when you have these, when they test these drugs out, so you test an anti-anxiety drug, you obviously dose this mouse with it, expose it, and expose it to. It should reduce essentially the running back and forth in the confined condition, but it shouldn't reduce essentially the intensity at which it's fleeing in the fear condition. So that's how you essentially test the efficacy of these drugs. So, and the whole point of that is obviously because if you want to reduce, let's say you can't go hiking because you have extra high anxiety about being hunted down by a predator. So in that case, it might be useful to take some anti-anxiety meds so you can actually go hiking and see the world. But when you do, or if you do come across the bear, you don't want to be less afraid of the bear. You want to be just as afraid. You still want to have a healthy fear of that bear. So the third benefit of anxiety is that it boosts awareness. And the way I like to think about this, and because we've all been there, every now and then you'll just notice you kind of zone out. You don't really notice the zoning out part. You just notice the zoning back in part, and you just, whoa, and you just go, what was I just doing? It's not like you just woke up from a nap. But anyway, we've all been there. So that's basically like what anxiety does. In those conditions, that's not anxiety. In those conditions, you're just at a reduced state of vigilance. Basically, when your body, if everything's going according to plan, you kind of just wind it down a little bit. You're not as vigilant looking around. So when everything's going according to plan, you sort of become less aware of your surroundings. But then when something sort of disrupts that, that's when you start, kind of taking up your states of vigilance. So anxiety does a great job. Basically, it's just boosting you up from where you were to essentially where you need to be to identify any potential threats in the environment. Okay, so those are three adaptive benefits of anxiety. Again, one, it increases performance on mentally challenging tasks or mentally demanding tasks. Two, it increases defensive behaviors. And three, it boosts awareness. So again, you could really see, the adaptive value of anxiety. Again, too much anxiety, not a good thing. So that about sums up our tour of the adaptive value of pain, both physical pain and emotional pain. So what happens when you disrupt these mechanisms? Well, that's something I'm going to talk about next in my interview with Dr. Andrew Gallup. Andrew and I are currently investigating the use of painkillers as an evolutionary mismatch. So I'm here with Andrew Gallup, and we're going to talk about the adaptive value of pain and what happens when these mechanisms become disrupted. So we already covered why pain is adaptive, but maybe you want to rehash that a little bit.
Yeah, so pain, although inherently unpleasant, is highly adaptive because it draws our attention to stimuli that are harmful and detrimental, and functions to motivate response to alleviate that harm and to reduce pain. So drawing our attention to a painful stimulus, having behavioral modification to eliminate or alleviate pain or harm from that stimulus, which also functions to promote associative learning thereafter to reduce certain behaviors into the future that might lead to painful outcomes. So pain is really, really adaptive in that regard. And we see this, most notably, the adaptive value of pain is witnessed among individuals that fail to experience it. That's where we see really the most significant kind of functionality to these responses when it's absent. So individuals with congenital insensitivity to pain, they're born without the ability to sense pain. They often suffer traumatic injuries very early on in life, self-inflicted injuries in many regards too, and show reduced longevity in adulthood. So pain, being an unpleasant stimulus to deal with, is very, very adaptive, promotes survival and beneficial behavioral outcomes.
So what happens when we disrupt these mechanisms? What happens when, say we take painkillers to sort of disrupt this or dull this pain response?
Yeah, so painkillers are designed, pharmaceutically designed to reduce or dull or blunt that pain response, which can be very beneficial in medical settings following, surgeries or long-lasting injuries. You might take some painkillers to kind of alleviate that pain. And while that is a beneficial outcome, it also has this kind of overall generalizing effect on blunting our sensitivity to painful stimuli or existing injuries that we possess, and therefore the routine use of like over-the-counter painkillers, for example, for chronic pain, that could actually lead to maladaptive outcomes, because there's the unnoticed continuous use of the body that would be sensitive to pain. By blunting that, you can increase or exacerbate existing injuries, increase the likelihood that you might incur greater tissue damage as a result of the pain-killing effects. So there are a lot of negative outcomes to it. And the painful stimulus, again, being that kind of signal that, okay, we need to modify our behavior, we need to alleviate this pain. If that's blunted, you can continuously do harm, potential harm to your tissue. And it's interesting, there's similar types of mismatches that over-the-counter painkillers produce. So many over-the-counter painkillers are used to treat pain, aches and pains, physical discomfort, relief from headaches, and also many of them serve as an antipyretic or a fever reducer. But the same types of negative outcomes could occur for headaches and the fever reducing properties. Routinely using pain-killing medications to dull headaches doesn't get at the source of the problem itself, and instead just treats the symptoms. So instead of promoting kind of behavioral changes, maybe better hydration or whatever it is that might be a cause of that underlying headache, you just reach for the over-the-counter painkillers and dull it, and you're continuously going down that track that could have long-term negative consequences. And with regard to fever, fevers are also adaptive. Again, very unpleasant to endure, particularly at higher temperatures. But fever is your body's adaptive response to fight off illness. And by just continuously, if you have a fever, if you dull that with antipyretic, it actually reduces the likelihood of your immune system to effectively fight that illness, increases the time in which you will retain that sickness, and increases also the likelihood that you can spread that sickness onto others around you. The fever would serve as a much more effective type of response. Now, of course, if fevers are really high, and they can be detrimental to your health, and you should treat them with pain-killing medications or antipyretics. But the fever in and of itself is not harmful, and in fact is beneficial. Yeah, there's good reason to suggest that we should endure the fevers that we have, in so much that they're not harmful to our health. Research, in fact, shows that among critically ill patients in the hospital, those that are treated with antipyretics actually have higher mortality rates. Which is, again, contrary to popular belief. You'd think you'd want to treat them, you'd want to reduce that negative type of feeling, and maybe that would help them get better, but in fact it has the opposite.
That's kind of like how this whole notion of like with the congenital insensitivity to pain, like these individuals, it's not that they're just running over their feet with lawnmowers and that's why their body gets damaged. It's very subtle things, like how they sit, when you sit and you become uncomfortable, if your legs are crossed and your knee might not be getting the right circulation, and if you don't feel even that slight discomfort, they don't modify their behavior.
Yeah.
So it seems like these painkillers might be adaptive or not adaptive, but useful in extreme situations. But in the more subtle situations where it would inspire sort of behavioral modification, that's what we really don't want to get in the way of. Right. But there are other unintended consequences of some painkillers, right?
Yeah, actually there are. Recent research has revealed a lot of these, quote, hidden types of psychological effects of painkiller use. So the most commonly used painkiller in the United States is Tylenol. The pain-killing drug in Tylenol is acetaminophen. So research suggests that about 1 in 4 adults in the United States consumes a drug that contains acetaminophen each week. So that is roughly about 80 million Americans weekly. And research shows that parents are also more likely to give their kids Tylenol or acetaminophen when they are suffering from pain or as an antipyretic to reduce fever. So it's the most widely used over-the-counter painkiller that we have in the United States. And what's interesting specifically about acetaminophen is that the mechanisms of its analgesic properties or its pain-killing properties occur centrally rather than in the periphery. And that central mechanism of pain relief means that it could also have other types of psychoactive effects, changes in mood, cognition, and behavior. And some early research actually examined what kind of effects acetaminophen has on other types of distressful experiences, not those that are just painful stressors, but social and emotional types of stressors. So this is based on a backdrop of research that shows that the areas of the brain that process physical pain overlap with those that also process social and emotional pain. So in other words, when we are experiencing social pain from exclusion or isolation or embarrassment, our brain processes that similarly. At least there's a neurological signature that's similar to the way we process physical pain, which gives credence to the saying that words hurt. So based on this similar neurobiological coupling of physical and social pain, some researchers back in 2010, they assessed whether or not acetaminophen might also diminish those psychological forms of pain in the way that it diminishes physical pain. And they did a number of different experiments. And what they were able to uncover is that acetaminophen does diminish our perception of social pain and distress. And they demonstrated this both in kind of naturalistic about social distress and psychological pain that you might be experiencing in your life outside of the laboratory, and they also demonstrated with laboratory manipulations that are designed to induce social stress, such as the cyberball game, which is a manipulation that induces social exclusion in a ball tossing game. And they showed that participants that were given administered acetaminophen experienced less social distress and pain to those scenarios, and again reported less social pain in their daily lives as well. And neurologically, they found that acetaminophen diminished or attenuated neural activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, and these are areas of the brain that process pain. So it has its analgesic properties, again, appear to act centrally, which dulls physical pain. It's very effective in doing that, but also has these effects in reducing social and psychological pain, which we've only recently been able to uncover. So that individuals taking acetaminophen are likely to have altered perceptions of social experiences, and which could impact their daily lives and well-being with intimate partners or co-workers, etc. In addition, research has examined how it impacts all sorts of other types of effects too, and we're really beginning to only uncover or beginning to scratch the surface of the psychological consequences of taking acetaminophen.
Didn't it also essentially reduce their perception of other individuals going through pain?
Yeah.
So one is like you yourself being socially excluded, and you might not feel the negative consequences of that very strongly, but if you see another individual going through physical or emotional pain, then they actually had a reduced response.
People that take acetaminophen have also shown reductions in empathy for pain in others. So they read different vignettes about people that are undergoing social pain or distress, or have encumbered some physical injuries, and how much does that distress you? How much does that make you feel an empathic response for those individuals? And again, people have taken acetaminophen, their responses are fairly blunted in comparison to those that are given a placebo or a control substance, which show typical empathy responses.
And considering we are an emotional species, and so much of our success as a species has been because we associate in groups and we have empathy towards others, that dulliness would clearly be maladaptive, not just to the individual but societal as well. And ultimately, I believe the United States is about 5% of the world's population, but I believe they consume about 80% of the world's pain-killing supply. So it's certainly something that's worthy looking into domestically.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in addition to opioid painkillers, which produce a number of other types of negative outcomes, these just over-the-counter painkillers, which are widely accessible and consumed daily, can have these negative unintended consequences. And we really don't know the long-term effects of routine acetaminophen use and how it impacts everyday real-world experiences. But researchers are trying to uncover those things now. So it's also been kind of interesting, the work on acetaminophen. It doesn't just associate with kind of social pain or social distress. It also has been shown to blunt pain associated with difficult decisions. So they bring people into the lab and they give them with these kind of dilemmas that make them kind of have these calculations, and that there's not a real clear optimal decision. It's a tough choice, and there's always going to be trade-offs, and people kind of agonize over what they should do.
Yeah.
And people that have taken acetaminophen, they show less anxiety about that, less pain associated with making these decisions. So think about critical decisions in your everyday life.
Yeah.
If you're under the influence of these centrally activated pain-killing drugs, you might be just making decisions that you didn't give careful consideration to.
Yeah.
And you might not reflect on later on like you would if you were really agonizing about those decisions. So yeah, it's scary stuff to think about. And I try and limit my use of these types of drugs unless necessary.
Oh yeah, for sure. Oh, well, thank you so much for that
yeah, sure.
that information. All right.